Guys, so yesterday we started talking about photosynthesis. We talked about how electrons are excited, how that occurs in the photosynthetic pigments, and that chlorophyll A then passes those excited electrons into the electron transport chain. Today we're going to talk about what the electron transport chain is and what its role is in photosynthesis. We're also going to look at some of the other reactions that take place in the process of photosynthesis. So for these photosynthetic reactions, we're going to be going over the different forms of energy and energy-rich molecules that are produced during the process of photosynthesis. We're going to look at the difference between light-dependent and light-independent reactions. We're going to look at the different stages of photosynthesis, including photon absorption, electron excitation in those photosystems, the electron transport chain, photolysis, redox reactions, chemiosmosis, and the Kelvin cycle. So photosynthesis is used to convert energy from photons of sunlight into chemical energy, which is stored in the bonds of glucose. Each glucose molecule is made of 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water molecules, but the process involves a whole series of chemical reactions where there's numerous kind of intermediate molecules produced, and then we end up with some rich, energy-rich molecules. So glucose is the main product of photosynthesis. It is used as a transport molecule and most importantly for energy storage. ATP is the main energy supply molecule for cell functions. ATP provides immediate energy for cell processes like cell transport and stuff like that. And then NADPH is an electron donor used in electron transfer. So ATP, also called adenosine triphosphate, is a molecule that has 3 high energy phosphate bonds. So up at the top here, this is ATP. It has the adenosine and then 1, 2, 3 phosphates bonded to it. ATP is used in both plant and animal cells as an immediate energy supply for everything from protein synthesis to molecule transport to the growth of different cells. ATP is made by taking an ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and just adding another phosphate to it. So we have the ADP down at the bottom here. We add another phosphate to it. It requires energy in order to do that, and then we end up with this high energy ATP molecule. If we want to use the energy that's stored in ATP for any of these cell functions, we just break off the 3rd phosphate and that releases the energy that the cell can then use. NADPH is a molecule that donates 1 hydrogen and 2 electrons to another molecule. That's why it's called an electron donor. It gives away its electrons. When NADPH does this, it becomes NADP+. The NADP+ can then take 1 hydrogen and 2 electrons from another molecule and become NADPH again. So just by moving electrons and a hydrogen back and forth, we can convert between NADPH, which is the high energy version, and NADP+. Okay, so there's 3 main stages of photosynthesis. Stage 1 is the absorption of solar energy, which is then transferred to the electrons to make them excited. Stage 2 is using that energy to make ATP, as well as NADPH, which again is a high energy molecule because it carries high energy electrons. And then stage 3 is to use the ATP that we formed in stage 2, as well as other high energy electrons in NADPH to form glucose. All of that will make more sense once I start adding some visuals in. So don't worry too much if that slide's not making sense to you. Okay, the light-dependent reactions are the reactions in photosynthesis that require sunlight. They take place in the chlorophyll inside the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast. And this is where both stage 1 and stage 2 of photosynthesis occur. So inside the chloroplast, we have chlorophyll as well as some of the other photosynthetic pigments. they're found in clusters inside the thylakoid membrane. Those clusters are called photosystems. There are two different photosystems. They're called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. And what's going to happen is solar energy is going to be absorbed by the photosynthetic pigment. That's going to excite the electrons in that pigment. And then that excited electron gets passed from chlorophyll A into what's called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain, which is ETC for short, is where high energy electrons are passed between a series of molecules, like a chain of molecules that transport electrons. After the excited electron leaves the photosystem, it goes into the ETC. That pigment now needs to get new electrons, and it does that through a process called photolysis. So photo meaning light, lysis meaning to break down. This is using light to break something apart. In this case, it's using solar energy to break apart a water molecule. When we do that, we take the H2O, we break off the oxygens to make oxygen gas. Then we have the hydrogen atom, and we take off one of its electrons. So we end up with an H+, which is our hydrogen ion, the oxygen gas, which is O2, and then the electron from the hydrogen. And then those electrons go into the photosystem that just lost its electrons. Photolysis takes place in the thylakoid lumen, which is the inside of the pancake. And then the electrons go into the thylakoid membrane where our photosystems are. So the way this works is we get 2 water molecules plus the solar energy gives us 4 hydrogen ions, 4 electrons, and O2. Okay, stage 2 involves the movement of the high energy electrons through the electron transport chain. Every time the electron moves from one molecule to the next in the ETC, it loses a little bit of energy. Every time electrons are passed from one molecule to another, that's called a redox reaction, which stands for reduction oxidation reaction. So we have all these redox reactions happening as the electrons move through the ETC. And by the time the electron gets to the end of the ETC, it is low energy again. It has lost all of its energy through those redox reactions. Anytime you have these redox reactions happening, the molecule that is gaining the electrons is called reduced. So that molecule is being reduced when it gains electrons. Oxidation is the molecule that's losing the electrons, that's passing the electrons on. So that's why every time an electron moves between 2 molecules, one of them is losing the electrons, so it's being oxidized. The other one is gaining the electrons, it's being reduced. So electrons actually start out in photosystem 2. So the photosystems are called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, but photosystem 2 comes first. Confusing, I know, but photosystem 1, which comes second, was discovered first, and they didn't rename them. Anyway, so the electrons start in photosystem 2. They get excited, get passed into the ETC. As they go through the ETC, they're going through these redox reactions, they're losing energy, and some of that energy that they're losing is used to pump hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane into the thylakoid lumen. And so we get a buildup of hydrogen ions inside the lumen. And then, like I said, by the time the electrons get to the end of the ETC, they're low energy again. And at that point, they go into photosystem 1, which is the second photosystem. There, they absorb more photons, get re-excited, and then they go back into another shorter version of the ETC. But this time, before they get before they go through too many redox reactions, they get picked up by NADP+. NADP+ takes on the electrons. They are now still high energy electrons. They turn the NADP+ into an NADPH, which is now a high energy molecule. Okay, so again, the NADP+ gets turned into NADPH. It's picking up the high energy electrons from the second little ETC section, also going to bond to some hydrogen ions. That's where the H comes from. And so that means that the NADP+ is reduced to form NADPH. Remember, anytime I say reduced, that means it's gaining electrons. The reason we use the term reduced, even though you're gaining something, is because electrons are negative, so the charge is reduced. In this case, the molecule went from positive to neutral, so its charge is reduced. Yeah, NADPH then donates the electrons to other molecules in stage 3. We'll talk about that when we get to stage 3. But when that happens, the NADPH gives up its electrons, so it is now being oxidized. It turns back into the NADP+. Okay, so this is kind of what's happening here. We have, this is like the thylakoid, so this is our chloroplast. Each pancake is our thylakoid, and then we have zoomed in on the thylakoid membrane here. That's what you can see. And then this is the thylakoid lumen, which is the inside of the thylakoid, the inside of the pancake. And then outside, just in the rest of the chloroplast, is the stroma. So what happens, we're going to start here at photosystem 2, remember is the first photosystem, and light is going to come in and it's going to excite the electrons. So these electrons are now excited. Those excited electrons then get passed into the ETC, the electron transport chain, which is these 1, 2, 3 purple molecules here. And every time the electron gets passed from one of these molecules to the next, that's a redox reaction, the electron is losing a little bit of its energy. Some of that lost energy is used to pump these hydrogen ions through this transport protein into the lumen. So you have a buildup of these hydrogen ions inside the lumen. Then by the time the electron reaches the end of this little ETC, it's back to being low energy. That's why the arrow's back at the bottom here. The energy has gone down. So we have more light coming into photosystem 1. That's going to re-excite these electrons. And then they get passed once again into an electron transport chain. But this time, before our electrons can lose very much energy, they are picked up by the NADP+. The NADP+ is reduced as it gains those electrons and becomes NADPH. Okay, so that's everything that we've talked about so far. We haven't talked about what's happening with this last little weird molecule down here. We'll get into that next. So chemiosmosis is the process where ATP is made. Essentially, all of those hydrogen ions that were pumped across the thylakoid membrane into the lumen creates an electrochemical gradient. Electro because all of the hydrogens are positive, so it's an electrical charge of positive, and electrochemical, a chemical gradient because we have all of these hydrogens. So we have this electrochemical gradient across the thylakoid membrane. And that is a type of potential energy. An electrochemical gradient is a type of stored potential energy. So that energy can be released and can be used. So that's where that weird looking molecule comes in. That weird looking molecule is called the ATP synthase complex. The hydrogen ions can diffuse from the lumen, from the inside of the pancake, through that ATP synthase molecule and back out into the stroma. When those hydrogen ions diffuse out, they release some of that stored electrochemical energy. And that released energy is what we use to bind a phosphate to an ADP in order to make ATP. So we use that released electrochemical energy to create the high energy ATP molecule. Okay, so this is the weird looking molecule that we were looking at. Actually, I'll go back to the previous picture. This is it right here. So we have all those hydrogen ions that are built up in the thylakoid lumen. They have that stored electrochemical energy. Those hydrogen ions will diffuse out of the lumen back into the stroma through this ATP synthase complex. As the hydrogen ions diffuse out, they release some of that stored potential energy. That energy is then used to take a phosphate, bind it to an ADP to create an ATP. Okay, after all that, we get into stage 3, which is the light independent portion of photosynthesis. This means that no light is required. This stage, unlike the previous 2 stages, which take place in the thylakoid membrane, this stage takes place entirely in the stroma of the chloroplast, which is just like the jelly filling. This is where what's called carbon fixation occurs. Essentially, we take carbon dioxide and we turn it into glucose. That's what carbon fixation is. In order to do that, we also need water molecules, plus we need the ATP that we just made, and we need the NADPH that we made. And all of that happens in something called the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is the name for the light independent reaction. So the Calvin cycle uses the ATP that we made during chemiosmosis. It uses the NADPH that we got from the end of the electron transport chain. And it's going to create G3P, which is the name of a sugar. The G3P is then just converted into glucose. Carbon dioxide is also needed for this, as is water molecules. So in order to make just a single glucose molecule, we need 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water molecules, 18 ATP, and 12 NADPH. Then we make our glucose, which can later on be converted into starch or other forms of sugar. Okay, so again, the light-dependent reactions take place in the thylakoid membranes. They require light. In those light-dependent reactions from the electron transport chain, we get our NADPH. From the chemiosmosis, we get the ATP. And both of those are going to go out to the stroma where the Calvin cycle occurs. The Calvin cycle fixes the carbon dioxide into C3P and then glucose using the energy from the NADPH and the energy from the ATP. When the ATP's energy is used, it breaks apart again, so it goes back to ADP, and that last phosphate on the ATP gets broken off. And our NADPH is going to be oxidized. It loses its electrons and gets turned back into the NADP+. Okay, I'm going to kind of summarize all of this one more time with my own diagram, and then we'll be done for the day. Okay, so this is the light-dependent portions of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis all takes place in the chloroplast. This part, the light-dependent reactions, take place in the thylakoid. So this right here is all the thylakoid membrane. You can't see it super clearly on my screen just because my pencil has faded. But all across here, this is all the thylakoid membrane. On the outside, we have the stroma. On the inside, we have the thylakoid lumen. So we're going to start here with photosystem 2. The light is going to come in, hit the electrons in the photosynthetic pigments, and excite them. Chlorophyll A then passes those excited electrons into the ETC, which is right in here. The electrons go through the ETC, losing energy along the way. That energy that they lose is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma through a transport protein into the thylakoid lumen, where they build up. That's the electrochemical gradient that gets created. By the time the electrons get through that section of ETC, they are once again low energy. So the light comes in again, it hits those electrons, they get all excited and become higher energy again. Once again, chlorophyll A passes them into the electron transport chain. But this time, before they can lose very much energy, NADP+ is going to come along. It's going to pick up those electrons and become reduced, which means it is now NADPH. That NADPH is going to be used later on in the Kelvin cycle. Meanwhile, all of these hydrogens that have built up in the lumen from pumping the hydrogens across, which again, we got the energy for that for all these redox reactions that were happening through the ETC. All these hydrogen ions have stored chemical potential energy because of the electrochemical gradient. So as these hydrogen ions diffuse out through the ATP synthase complex, they diffuse out and they release that stored potential energy. That released energy is then used to take an ADP and add a phosphate to it, and by doing that, we create an ATP, which again is going to be used in the Kelvin cycle. The last thing to talk about with this is what's happening right down here, which is our photolysis. So every time an electron gets passed from photosystem 2 into the ETC, it needs to replace those electrons. And it does that through photolysis. So what happens is a light molecule comes in, it hits a water molecule. From that, we are going to get oxygen, half an oxygen molecule, because if we only have one water molecule, we only get one oxygen, but you can't have just an oxygen by itself. So we write half an oxygen molecule. Anyway, so we get half an oxygen molecule, 2 hydrogen ions, and then the electrons would go into the ETC. And I have just drawn this as kind of like 1 electron for simplicity's sake, but it would actually be 2 electrons at a time that are passing through here. Okay, so now we have our high energy molecules, our NADPH and our ATP. We're now going to go into the Kelvin cycle, which is the light independent portion of photosynthesis. Okay, which happens in the stroma of the chloroplast. In this case, we have 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water reacting with 18 ATP, 12 NADPH, and making G3P, which then gets converted into glucose. And all of this that we've talked about, all of this photosynthesis, the point of all of it is just to make this glucose. That is the stored energy that a plant needs. Okay? When the NADPH uses its energy to help make the G3P, it's giving up its high energy electrons. So it is being oxidized. It turns back into NADP+. The ATP also has to give up its energy. In that case, it releases energy by breaking off the 3rd phosphate. So it goes back to ADP and just an extra phosphate. Okay, that's it for photosynthesis. I know that it's a lot to wrap your head around, but please let me know if you have any questions.